Hey y'all, my name is Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today, and for this video we're going to be talking about my best and worst books of 2024. Alright, so before I get to anything bookish, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, and you have to tell me what is your best book of the year. I need to know. Let's see if you can add something more to my TBR list. I can't believe it's officially here. I can't believe it's, nearing the end of the year. It's just absolutely crazy. Thankfully, I did have a really good reading year. I really did have a hard time figuring out how I wanted to break down my top 10 books of the year, but ended up deciding to make it easy on myself. So I went through and ordered these based on my caw pile breakdown that I do. So I do actually have a top 10 list for you. But before we get into that, let's start on the low side. Let's start with the worst book so we can end on a high note. Thankfully, I really don't feel like I had a super bad reading year when it came to my worst books. Majority of these really come down to the fact I personally did not enjoy them, and then there were certain aspects of each of these books I did not feel were well done. That definitely resulted in a lower rating, but I across the board wouldn't really say any of these were bad books. I definitely think there's an audience for each of them. That audience just happens to not be me. Starting out with my third lowest rated book of the year is Instinct by Jason M. Hough. I actually ended up reading this for the lowest rated books from my owned TBR. I think that video came out pretty early this year, so I'll put a link to that in the card. So this is set in a small town in which we're following this woman who just recently has become a deputy in the town. She is literally the only police officer in town. And of course, when that happens, shit hits the fan. She has numerous calls in, and every single one of them seem like something that locals to this town would know to avoid. Situations that they should easily be able to handle themselves in. I think the author really nailed the small town vibes. I also feel like the creeping unsettlingness that starts in the book is really well done. However, it's a very slow build. It takes a while to really figure out where is this going? And once we see that reveal at, I don't know, I think it was like the 75% mark, this took an interesting twist. And then there's this huge jump in pacing. It feels like we're gearing up for the climax, but then suddenly things just drop right back down. And we're once again moving really slowly. And so it became a super jumpy ending. And then once we start to dive into why these nefarious things are happening in town, it just was really difficult for me to stay engaged because it's pretty outlandish. I think there was some commentary going on here, but it was just, it was a little too crazy for majority of this book to have felt very grounded. And then finally, I definitely think this author kind of fell into the trap of trying to write a female character because I did not like the main character, Mary, here. I could never quite put my finger on it, but there was always something in the little details that really screamed to me that this was not a authentic female character, that a man was writing her. Plus there was also this weird romance element with the bartender in the town that just felt very shoehorned in and really unnecessary. And especially towards the climax, the romance was something that kept taking away from the actual plot that was unraveling here. So I just didn't get why it was there. So in the end, I understood why this book was one of the lowest rated ones on my TBR shelf, because I didn't particularly like it either. The second worst book was one that I probably wouldn't have read myself. However, my friend Kat actually put this on my 12 recommendations from 12 friends list. And the reason she recommended it was because she owned a copy from Book of the Month and she wanted to see if I thought she would enjoy it. Spoiler alert, no. I already was really apprehensive going into this because I know of Lucy Foley's work, this one tends to get the lowest reviews, and honestly, I see why. We're following this young woman who is kind of running away from, I don't remember what happened, but something in London. And so she's planning to stay with her brother in Paris, but when she arrives there, her brother is nowhere to be found, and she ends up trying to kind of figure out what happened to him by talking to different people in his apartment complex. This is one of those books that reminds me again that I don't mind unlikable characters, but I need to be able to root for them, and I just did not feel that way about anybody here. In fact, I'd actually go so far to say that I hated some of these characters. Main character who's trying to figure out what happened to her brother, she was fine, I guess, but I don't really think you could call what she was doing investigating. This book was so slow moving and honestly really boring and frustrating. The final reveals, one of them was shocking to me, but the other, I was actually more hopeful the author wasn't going to be taking that turn, and then she did, just because I've seen it done before and I've seen it done much better. So when it was utilized here, it just was really lackluster. By the time I finished this book, it felt like I pushed through all of this for no real payoff, honestly. It was whatever. I've tried to read another book from this author recently and learned that clearly her writing style is not for me. So this is a book where it's very obvious that the author and we do not get along. I know other people enjoyed this. I did not. And finally, the worst book I read this year was 2 parts Sugar, 1 part Murder by Valerie Burns. I actually picked up an arc of this from a little free library. Lucky for me that I didn't end up spending my own money on this book. This is another book that I read at the start of this year, and by that point I was really starting to realize cozy mysteries are not my type. We don't get along super well, but I wanted to try this one out. We are following Maddie, who has always been this like really spoiled girl, and I think recently her father cut her off after she like left her fiance at the altar or something like that. But come to find out, she is the sole inheritor of her like great aunt's home as well as her bakery business. So she plans to run away to the small town and try to self-sustain with this house and the business. But pretty quickly that gets a little more difficult for her because a body is found within the bakery, and so it gets shut down. And seeing as how she's new to town, everybody is immediately suspicious of her. Like I said, I kept trying to make cozy mysteries happen for me, but they were not gonna happen.
Stop trying to make fetch happen. It's not going to happen.
I felt next to nothing about any of the characters in this book. I did not care about the little romance that was developing. Even the mystery I felt very ambivalent about. The strongest thing I felt about it was that it was predictable. One aspect I do specifically remember is that Maddie didn't know what a VHS was. Like, first off, ow, that hurts my back. But I remember, like, based on her age and when the book came out, she probably should have. She should have come into contact with them at some point in her life, or at the very least understood them from like a pop culture reference. I could not get past that. It still lives in my head because it was so ridiculous. There was also this ongoing thing of how she was sort of a Instagram influencer, and she was always taking photos and inserting all these 20 million hashtags, but in the way of people from like 2012 wrote hashtags. And then the mystery, like I said, first off, I thought it was predictable, but there was just a lot of elements around it that I thought were very silly. The fact that Maddie is always the one who conveniently uncovers new evidence or finds a new lead, and then she always manages to forget about them until it's convenient for her. And then finally, one element that I really was curious on whether or not this was a editing error was that the perpetrator, it's told who it is earlier on in the book. I don't know if the author accidentally let that slip, if it managed to get through all of the different edits and just nobody ever noticed it, or if it was supposed to be a clue and I just ended up putting 2 and 2 together. I'm not really sure. If it was just a clue, then oh my god, it is the most obvious clue I've ever seen. They literally gave away the mystery if they missed this in edits. So I don't know. Yeah, like I said, this one was very much not for me, but on top of that, there were issues in the book itself that I couldn't get past. So that came out to be my worst book of the year, unfortunately. So now that we're all done with the worst books of the year, let's jump into the positives by talking about my top 10 best books. Right out of the get-go, at number 10, I'm not surprised at all that this book managed up to my top 10 list, and that is Divine Might by Natalie Haynes. Now, this is almost a companion novel to Pandora's Jar, which was my best book of last year, and I read this one as a part of my feminist reading vlog in March. Again, I really thought I was gonna love it, and luckily, Natalie Haynes did not let me down. Pandora's Jar looked at the women from Greek mythology who were mortals, but Divine Might looked specifically at the divine women, the goddesses, viewing them through this new light, reanalyzing many of their different stories and analyzing them through a feminist lens. I've read a lot of Greek mythology by this point, and so I know a good amount about many of these different women's stories and was so excited to reanalyze them. I just really enjoy Haynes's work. I think she is very knowledgeable about this topic, but at the same time, she always manages to weave in some like dry humor. Not only are there some really good quotes throughout here, but it ties in female rage, female pain, the objectification of many of these women, the victimization of them, the erasure of some of them. It was just so interesting, but also so entertaining. Haynes still managed to teach me a few new things, even about some of the myths that I've heard time and time again, which I thought was very impressive. And between this book and Pandora's Jar last year, I absolutely can say I am always going to pick up whatever Natalie Haynes comes out with next. Then I have a relatively recent read that is definitely up here because I can't get this book out of my head. Frisia's Wrath by Emily Varga. I loved this one. It was so good. It is a Count of Monte Cristo retelling through the eyes of this young Pakistani woman who has spent the last year in jail and is planning out her revenge. You did get a little sneak peek to this one when I reacted to 1-star reviews, and I still can see some of the critiques people have had about this book, but again, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. There were certain romantic quotes in here that just are going to live in my head rent-free forever. But along with that, I also just loved that this book allowed our female main character to be angry. Loved the way that Danya was filled with so much rage and fury. She really rides the line at times into being a bit villainous, and I appreciated getting to see this sort of a character in that way, allowing her to feel that anger, because we get to see all of the betrayal she has lived through, and obviously that has hurt her insanely deeply, and it's no wonder she's going to take her power back and utilize it against these people. And then the Jin magic that was utilized here I thought was very clever in how it allowed certain situations to happen. But again, I will bring things back to the romance because it's just so well written. I mean, we have a Mr. Darcy hand flex scene, we have a little bit of a who did this to you in the past timeline at one point. There was also talk of periods and birth control, which I always find really refreshing because it's something so realistic that gets glossed over, even though, you know, it's a really integral part to a lot of people's everyday life. There's great acknowledgement around consent in this. Like I said, I cannot stop thinking about it. I absolutely will be rereading this in the future because I enjoyed it that much. Next up at number 8 is a book that unfortunately I don't currently have a physical copy of, but it was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. I am still mad at myself that I put off reading this for so long. I knew I was gonna enjoy it. I've heard so many positive things about it, and once I finally read it, I ate it up. I absolutely adored it. It was so cute. This was one of the books where my friend Kat actually annotated it for me for Christmas, and then I went through and annotated it and then passed it on to my friend Ali. So here's hoping I will be getting a more annotated version back here soon because I definitely want to have this on my shelves. It was so precious. So in the story, we were following Mika Moon, who is a witch that lives her life as a YouTuber creating magic content. But of course, you know, people think it's just like editing or she's just having a bit of fun with it. In reality, you know, real witches know the truth. And through these videos, she ends up actually getting a proposition to come to this house, the Nowhere House, in order to educate these 3 young witches and teach them about their magic. However, Mika has grown up being told that witches cannot congregate, but she can't help herself. She's really intrigued. And once she arrives there, she ends up finding this wonderful little found family that includes the very grumpy librarian Jamie, who she ends up having a romance with. I read this one for my witchy romance 5x5, and like I've already said a million times, I loved it. It was so cute. The found family feels are phenomenal. Every single one of the characters in this cast was so sweet, so well developed, and I just loved watching the dynamics work between them. I loved Mika finding her place within the family as well. Oh, it warmed my heart. I definitely think this is like a witchy sitcom sort of story where there are different little plots going on throughout the story that you love watching, and you just care so much about the characters that it doesn't really matter what they're getting into. You're gonna be here for all of the shenanigans. You know, when her new book comes out next year, I will be getting my hands on it as soon as possible. And a very different direction for this next one. I have to say, The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim is a horror book that I haven't been able to stop thinking about this year. I read this for my Is Evernight book box Worth It, and I am here to tell you that yes, because I loved this. This kept getting comped to Mayfly, and I do think that's accurate, but in a different way. First off though, this is following our main character of Ji-woon, who unfortunately at the start of this book, her father has left her mother and abandoned their family. This has really upset their lives, and unfortunately they're just trying to cope with it, but things get a little rough when her mother ends up dating a man named George, who is a bit of a creep. As if that wasn't hard enough to deal with, Ji-woon is now starting to crave blue eyeballs. This definitely was disgusting. This definitely was disturbing. But at the same time, I really enjoyed the commentary that was woven into the story. Watching Ji-woon grow up and kind of coming into her own as a woman, but also at the same time trying to protect her mother and her younger sister. Unfortunately, having to deal with racism and fetishization, trying to make friends of her own, and having to deal with romantic prospects for the first time, all while having these unsavory urges. This was slow building, and I definitely feel like a large reason why I enjoyed it so much is because there is so much exploration of the main character, but also the way the gore is written in this was just so visceral and unsettling. It was almost culinary at times. Like, it was disgusting, but at the same time I could like perfectly visualize and feel all of the sensations that the author was writing about what Ji-woon was experiencing. It was so disgusting, but it definitely stuck with me, obviously. I can't wait to see what Monica Kim comes out with next off of this because it was so good. Next one was also a horror book, and it was kind of just a random pickup that I did because I've heard so many positive things and I wanted something short and easy. This is Where We Talk Things Out by Caitlin Marceau. It is a novella, so I'm not going to give you a lot, but we are following this young woman who is getting married here soon, and she has no real connection to any of her family. But her mother keeps trying to weasel her way back in, so she finally takes pity on her and agrees to go on this girls' trip with her mom in order to kind of build a bridge again and hopefully actually have her mom attend her wedding. I'm just gonna leave it there, but this book was so good. This little novella packed such a punch. The way grief was handled in this, our main character's father passed a few years prior, and then the manipulative and toxic relationship she has with her mother, the way it is showcased, it's so grounded and authentic to people who are actually like this, who are so narcissistic and controlling. But at the same time, the main character is doing everything in her ability to try and make this work. She's being a people pleaser. She is constantly explaining herself, but there are so many moments where you just want to pick her up and shake her and tell her, you don't deserve this. You don't have to deal with this. And when the horror aspects of this start, it was really good. If you like horror, read this. It's short, it's easy, but it's unsettling, and another one that definitely is going to stick with me. We're going to continue the horror trend with this next book that ironically also came from Evernight, so yes, that book box is absolutely worth it. The Invocations by Crystal Sutherland. This was one that I really went into not wanting to know too much. I did not really do much research because I utilized it for multiple different book bingos where I needed to go into a book based purely on the cover. And this Evernight edition is stunning. Luckily, the inside was just as good. So we're alternating back and forth between these three women who all have ties to the occult. One of them is very rich and unfortunately has entered into a deal with multiple demons, and it is starting to take a serious toll on her body. Then we have another young woman who has recently lost her sister and is determined to do whatever she can to get her sister back. Finally is a woman who has spent most of her life living on the edges of society, just really making her way through, but she can be hired to do spells and curses for these different women. However, the three of them end up coming together whenever they realize that many of this third woman's customers are starting to disappear and pass in very violent ways. Another book where the character work was phenomenal. I'm very impressed at that, given the fact that we have to split our time between three characters, and yet every one of them felt so fleshed out. There was such a strong background to each of them, and the arc we watched them all go through is just as well done. The dynamics and relationships that developed between them as well were just as enticing. I really loved those too. The magic itself was really unsettling and creepy, but also grounded again in this very scary and realistic way. The atmosphere also adds to that. It is super gothic. Oh god, and then the intersectional feminist themes that are woven throughout. I got so engrossed in the mystery. I was so excited for these three women to figure out what was going on. I will admit that I did call big twist with the story, but I'm not gonna say that's a bad thing, because honestly, I think the author plotted everything out and left you enough clues to get there that wasn't super obvious, but also showcases like you can do it if you're paying attention. And even though I did expect it, that didn't make the emotional impact of that reveal hurt any less. Another book that every time I look at it, I'm just thinking back to the experience I had reading it. I also want to reread this one, and I'm definitely going to be checking out Sutherland's prior work and whatever she comes out with next. On a different note, but also like kind of comparable, is Wolf in Sheep's Clothing by 𝗖cie RH. This is the fourth in the Big Bad Wolf series, which is following Cooper Dayton, who works for the BSI. It is a supernatural portion of the FBI focusing on the crimes of werewolves. However, at the start of the first book, he ends up with a new partner, Oliver Park, who is actually a werewolf himself. Seeing as how this is a paranormal mystery romance series, I don't think it's a spoiler to say our two main characters end up as a couple. And in this fourth book, they actually end up going to this kind of couples retreat that is specifically geared towards werewolves and their partners, because there was a man who recently disappeared from it, and they are trying to see if they can figure out what happened to him. However, they're working undercover whilst doing this. This whole series is purely through the perspective of Cooper, but the development of both he and Park in this entire series is phenomenal. Oh my gosh. Another one where each of these characters literally hop off the page because they are so well built out. Like, you know everything about them by the end of the series. You get to see as they work through their traumas, as they learn more about each other, and as they grow as a couple. In this one in particular, I really felt like the development of their relationship just felt so realistic and authentic to the people that had been created in this series. The plot itself was also a really fun mystery that had some twists and turns I did not expect. I probably read this one fastest of the whole series, and that's really saying something because I blasted through pretty much every one of them. The spice in this one was also definitely spicing, but it's also funny and sweet. I loved these characters so much. This entire series I could probably slide in here, honestly, but this one in particular was my favorite. It had a certain moment that I always really enjoy in mystery stories with couples, so that also didn't hurt. I'm gonna continue ranting and raving about the series forever because I need everyone to read it, and once again, thank you to Destiny for recommending it to me. We're nearly there. We're at number 3, and this one is actually a book from my Star Wars canon project. Like, I did have a difficult time trying to suss out what was a Star Wars book that I read this year that I really, really loved. And then I realized Path of Deceit by Tessa Gratton and Justina Ireland. I'm still in awe of how this story wrapped up. So this is set in the High Republic era, about 100 years prior to the first prequel films. In this one, we are following a Jedi and her Padawan who are investigating these stolen artifacts that are all imbued with Force. This ends up leading them to a group called the Path of the Open Hand. I was super invested in the plot around this group because it's a cult, but it allows for this opposing view of the Force that's really different from how the Jedi see it, which is obviously the perspective we've seen of the Force for years now. And the fact that we get to see through the eyes of a character who is involved in this cult but also believes wholeheartedly in it made it even more interesting. The Path of the Open Hand believes that the Force is free to do as it wishes. So if the Jedi are to manipulate it to their own whims, then that takes the Force away from somewhere else where the Force believes it is needed. They think of it more as a sentient entity than the Jedi do, where the Force is imbued into everything. I really loved seeing the interactions between Marta, the cult member we were seeing, but also Kevmo, the Padawan, because both of them have such strong feelings about what they believe, and even though they're very similar in certain ways, they're obviously very different in others. This is young adult, and there is a little bit of like a developing romance between these two characters, but I also appreciated that for Kevmo since he's a Padawan and getting to see how he is having to handle that as a Jedi. The struggle he has between making connections with people but cutting them off before he becomes too emotionally invested. And that was a part of the story that I also felt like the authors just did very well. Between the two of them being on the younger side and then this like romance that's happening, this definitely warrants being a young adult story, but oh my gosh, I have rarely ever seen a young adult story go as far as this book ended up with the plot. Still in awe of it. I still can't believe they did that. It is crazy. I've read so many other books in the Star Wars universe, but this one I still remember very well. Next up is an author that I'm not surprised to see in my top 10 list because I've given her multiple 5 stars, and I'm not really super shocked that this is up there for the best romance I read this year, and I'm also sure I will not be alone with that. Funny Story by Emily Henry. First off, the setup of this book, I knew from it alone that I was gonna have a lot of fun with this. Following Daphne, who at the start of this book has just been left by her fiance for his female best friend who was dating Miles. So Daphne ends up moving in with Miles, and these two heartbroken kids try and slowly become friends. But along the way, Daphne starts to reflect on herself and how she has always lost herself in relationships, how she has really not established her own identity. And Miles really encourages and helps her do that, which I loved. I loved the focus on Daphne trying to be happy with herself first before jumping into another relationship. I loved seeing her make a really close female friend in the story as well. That just made me so happy. This didn't quite beat out Beach Read for me as my top Henry, but it is really close. It's really close because the character work done is just so good. Another one where both characters felt very well developed. They each have parental issues that they work through. There's this hilarious pettiness when it comes to the fact that they start fake dating when it comes to their exes. They tell their exes that they are now dating each other, which I loved that. That was hilarious. But it also wasn't done in a way that felt like the sole trope of the story. And I also appreciate that since fake dating isn't always my favorite. I was just in awe at the amount of emotion in the story, in each of the characters, and then between the both of them as well. Like I said, the self-reflection and growth we see Daphne go through in this was just great. I really appreciated that. And even though this did have some serious aspects to it, I still felt like I spent a lot of this book giggling and kicking my feet because it was just so sweet and funny and cute. Like I said at the start, this is another book that has absolutely cemented that Emily Henry is a favorite author for me. Finally, the best book that I read this year is another one where I was not able to get it out of my head. I still have not been able to get it out of my head. I've actually started thinking back on this book when analyzing other stories I'm reading, and that's how you really know I enjoyed it. Unlikable Female Characters by 𝗖cie. The Women Pop Culture Wants You to Hate. This is another book I read in my feminist reading vlog in March. It probably takes up majority of that video, so if you want a lot of thoughts on it, go watch that. I loved this. It mixes feminist themes with film, and it goes through analyzing all of these different female character archetypes, how they came to be, and then how they have been evolving since we have started to appreciate unlikable female characters. Making a character unlikable allows for so much more exploration, for so much more fun in the writing, in the nuance of the character, when the author isn't concerned about whether or not people are going to like this character. Just gonna pull out a few quotes to kind of reinforce what this book's about. The silent implication of being unlikable is that it's a free pass to be dismissed, disrespected, and disempowered. We are now living in a cultural reckoning of the stories we have accepted as canon, questioning the rules and empathizing with the characters we had point blank considered villainous or unlikable. We're finally asking ourselves the questions, why do I consider her unlikable? So like I was saying, the author goes through the many different female tropes that are utilized in stories and kind of unpacking them, which I loved. And some of the characters from these best books I had on this list are definitely unlikable female characters. And like I said, I couldn't help analyzing them through this lens thanks to this book. And so on that note, that is it for today, y'all. Thank you so much for coming to my channel. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, leave me the star emoji in the comments. I have all my socials as well as a few ways you can support me linked in the description. I come out videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you, bye!